So I have several topics. Were anyone here for my husband yesterday, Alex, Lindsey? Who? Yeah, exactly who. It was my idea first to have you guys pick what topic you wanted to hear about, and he decided to do the same thing as well. He just happened to be on the schedule first yesterday. So this was my idea that he stole, just so you know. But I have several topics I can cover, and we can go to whenever. I have some information about benefits of wheat, going along with what Dennis Pennington said earlier. Some data on soybean relative maturity, which Manny and Dennis also talked a little bit about. Seeding rate, row width, fertility, PK, foliar fertilizer. So what do you guys want to hear about? Fertility. Fertility is a good one.
I didn't cover that.
So we'll start with P and K. So I may have talked about this a few years ago, but in 2013 through 2015, we had a really large study across the state. We worked with 199 farmers, which is extremely disappointing because I should have counted how many farmers I had and just got one more to get 200. But technically, we worked with 199 farmers or fields in the state of Ohio. We documented cultural practices. We took soil samples for soil fertility. We also looked at soybean cyst nematode. What we did, this is an example field. We would ask the farmers, where did you get your good yields or your normal yields? And then we took samples, soil samples from those areas, and then where's your low yield? And then we took samples in those areas as well, so we could compare differences in those areas of the field. So I'm just going to focus on the soil fertility part of this study because it was really the thing that kind of rose to the surface out of everything we measured. So this is now outdated because I saw Steve's presentation this morning. But when we did the study, this was the tri-state fertilizer recommendations and the philosophy behind that. So basically, for soil test levels for P and K, if you're low, you're in the buildup range, you need to build up nutrients. If you're in that maintenance range, you just want to maintain. And then above that, you can stop applying fertilizer. So for soil test P, each of these dots represents a field we went to and we pulled a soil sample from. And it was several soil samples from those 3 different areas in the field. So over this course of the study, it was close to 600 soil samples. So where there was a black dot, it means we pulled a soil sample and there was at least one area in the field that needed phosphorus fertilizer. 65% of the fields that we went to had some sort of need for phosphorus fertilizer. And this means it was either the soil test P was either in the buildup range or that maintenance range where we're trying to maintain nutrients. We were also able, from about a third of the fields, get yield maps. And so we were able to, going back to this slide, overlay our yield map with our sampling areas and figure out the yield for those sampling areas. So when soil test P was below the critical level, and the critical level in this study is the same as the revised tri-states, when soil test P levels were below that critical level, the average yield was about 50 bushels per acre. If we were above that critical level, the average yield was 57. So that's a 7 bushel per acre yield difference between that buildup range or anything above that buildup range. And 21% of those 600 soil samples we collected were below the critical level. So with the new tri-states, that would be 20 parts per million malic P. In this study, that would have been 15 parts per million under the old tri-states. Same cutoff there, though. So 21%, which I think was pretty high. Soil phosphorus is a hot button issue. If you guys haven't heard yet, that's a thing. The maintenance in the new tri-state is 20 to 40 parts per million. That's malic. This is data that I worked with Libby Dayton on. She got soil test data from 3 major soil testing labs that service Ohio. And it was thousands and thousands and thousands of data points on a zip code level, but we put it on a county level here. So this top color, that light, I guess, pinky peach color, that means a county was decreasing in soil test P between 1993 and 2015. The red meant there's an increasing trend. And then, of course, we have non-significant or insufficient data, so not enough soil samples. And so what's really interesting with this data, what color is the majority of Ohio counties? Decreasing. So the majority of counties in Ohio have decreasing soil test P levels, which is really great. There's a few that are increasing. The numbers in the county are the average soil test P value from the county. And so I know Wood County really well because we go there for the Reacher's Farm a lot. So 33, Wood County. So the average soil test P value from those soil testing labs in Wood County, and this is just for the final year, 2015, was 33 parts per million. Where does that fit? Right in there. So that's a really good story for farmers. And of course, there's people that are much higher and there's people that are much lower. This is just the average. But the average soil test P value in Wood County was 33. Right below that, I think that's Hancock County, is that right? 35. Where does 35 fit? Right in there. So that's really great. And even these counties that are increasing soil test P, I think Crawford, am I right? Is that Crawford? Crawford is increasing the soil test P, but it's 31. So it's still in that range. So I think that's a really good story for farmers that the trend is really positive and heading in the right direction. But it takes time. We also looked at phosphorus balance in this same paper. So phosphorus balance is looking at phosphorus inputs. So we looked at inputs of fertilizer, commercial fertilizer, and manure. And you subtract the phosphorus removed from crop yield. So when we remove grain, you're removing P from the grain. And looked at the balance. So it's basically what is applied versus what is removed. And so the lighter colors here are negative soil balances, these two lightest colors. So that basically means in these counties, and these are all estimates, in those counties, phosphorus outputs through grain exceed what farmers are applying either as manure or commercial fertilizer P. So again here, the majority of the counties in Ohio are these lighter colors. Of course, we have some in the darker. The numbers in the county, I only put the numbers if it's significant. Those indicate the trend. So any county with a negative value is decreasing in soil balance. So I'm from Richland County. Richland County is here. So basically this is saying in Richland County there's and this is megagram, so I apologize, I didn't convert that, 25 megagram per hectare per year decrease in phosphorus. So that basically means our crop yields are going like this and what farmers are applying is going like this. So that relates back to those soil test levels that are decreasing as well. So any questions about that before I move on? Because that's okay. All right, so we'll move on to K. Soil test K is not nearly as hot button, but also important to look at. Same thing here as what we did for soil test P. We pulled these soil samples where there's a dark dot that's filled in. That means we pulled a soil sample from those fields, and at least one area of the field needed K fertilizer. That was 58%. So 58% of those 199 fields needed K fertilizer somewhere in their field. And again, we looked at yields from those areas. So below the soil test K, average yield was 52 bushels per acre. If the field or the area of the field was above that critical level, average yield was 56 bushels per acre. So there was some yield differences there. And again, 23% of our soil samples were below the critical level for soil test K. And we did adjust for CEC looking at these numbers. So always then the next question is more fertilizer better? Our crop yields are higher now than what they were when the tri-states first came out. So do we need more fertilizer because our yields are higher? So what we did, we compared soil test P within that maintenance range, so 20 to 40 parts per million malic versus anything above 40 to see what the yields were in that area. There was a 3 bushel difference, but it was statistically not significant. So those fields that had really high soil test P yielded technically, statistically the same as those fields in that maintenance range. Same thing for soil test K. Looking at fields within that range or areas of fields within that range versus above, 1 bushel difference, but then it was not significant. So any questions about that P and K? Yeah.
Is there any data from fertilizer retailers, like over the past 2 decades, on the amount of phosphate fertilizer sold? I think that would be interesting.
Yeah, so the question was about phosphorus fertilizer sold. And IPNI, the International Plant Nutrition Institute, they have a website. It's called NUGIS, and they actually have some of that data at a county level where they look at fertilizer. I don't know if it's sold or applied or how that works, but there's some of that data on their website. And that's where our balance data came from, those fertilizer sale records. Any other questions? Yeah.
I got a question about 3 or 4 slides ago you had where, for example, Allen County was one of the counties where your phosphorus levels, salt test values are going up. Right there.
Is Allen where it's 40?
Right there. So your salt test values are going up.
Yep.
But then in your next slide, you got a higher negative, so your removal is a lot higher than what's being applied. How's that correlate?
So these are 2 different data sets, completely different data sets. This is soil test sample, soil that was pulled from the counties, and we worked with 3 soil test labs to get their data. So that was physically what came into that lab. That was soil test values. This one isn't based on soil at all. This is based on fertilizer sales, manure applications from that county, minus the crop yield to get the balance. So it's kind of a two different data sets, that 2 different sources of information as well. And the time period is slightly different as well, 93 to 2015. The IPNI data, I think they looked at data every 5 years, and I don't remember what last year it was, but it was slightly different time scale as well. Absolutely. Any other questions about that? Do you want to hear about foliar fertilizers? That's next. All right. We'll stick with fertilizer then. So we have 1-year foliar fertilizer data. Manny from Michigan State, he participated in this trial as well. So we had 20 trials across 13 states, which is great. So we worked with a lot of agronomists. Ohio, we only had 1 trial here in South Charleston. We wanted one in Wood County, but when planting became tight, this project got cut in Wood County because it was really hard to plant. But you can see the range of states we had: Minnesota, Wisconsin, down looks like Georgia, Florida line. I know that's a band, right? But range across the U.S. So we looked at several products, and these were because they were national in scope. We didn't really have any favorites, but these are things that we could get across all of these different states. And you can see a lot of them were packages, or all of them were packages that supplied several nutrients. And then, of course, we had our control, and then the rate that was suggested by those companies. This is the yield for Ohio. This is the control. And those are the treatments. Completely non-significant. There was no effect of any of those products on soybean yield. And our yields in Ohio were extremely high, 75 bushels per acre as a trial average there for South Charleston, that location. Anyone want to guess? We had 20 studies total across the U.S. Ohio was not significant. How many do you think were significant out of that 20? 0? 5, 0, 5, 2?
1.
Harold's a cheater. He knows. There's always one. There's always one in the group. But yes, Harold is correct. There was one site out of all 20 that had a response to one product. And it was Wisconsin, and I can't tell you which of the Wisconsin sites it was. I didn't pay that much attention. But it was one site in Wisconsin had a yield response to one product. So
What was the timing of that application?
that was R3. we're trying to think about when you may apply a foliar product, insecticide, fungicide. So we're going to repeat this again next year. We'll probably, or I guess it's this year now, we're going to repeat this again. We'll have more locations because hopefully the weather won't be as bad, but we're going to keep building this data set. We also took plant samples, so we had leaf samples before application and then 2 weeks later, so we can actually see do these nutrients get in the plants or not. So we'll have some of that data next year as well. So, yeah. Yeah, one Wisconsin. It was the nitrogen plus potassium product in Wisconsin. So, yeah, so what else do you guys want to hear about? I can go back. Maturity? So the one really great thing about this meeting, I guess there's several great things about this meeting, but it's always really cool to hear what like Manny says and what Dennis says and how our Ohio data fits in, because our results are extremely similar. We didn't have a planting date effect that we didn't look at that like Manny did, but our normal planting dates are very similar to what he has seen. We did things with relative maturity 2017 and 2018. We looked at 16 different cultivars, so that's why we didn't have all the other factors that Manny did, because 16 is a lot. Looking at as low as a 0.3 to a 3.8 here in Wood County, or not here, but close to here in Wood County. This is the response curve, so this is across the 2 years. We're looking at grain yield in bushels per acre versus relative maturity, again, that 0.3 to that 3.8, I think. So looking at this response curve, we can calculate where this curve, it's kind of linear and then flattens off. So anything between a 2.9 and a 3.8 in Wood County yielded the same. So no yield benefit in Wood County those 2 years from going over a 2.9 relative maturity, and even a little bit lower, that slope is less. So even 2.5 isn't that different in yield. But looking at the time it takes to get to the R8 stage, that difference is 7 days. So that 2.9 reached R8 7 days earlier than the 3.8. So going back to facilitating cover crop planting or wheat or barley planting, that helps get that crop potentially harvested sooner. It is.
And what about it? How many days would that make it earlier?
It's about 1 day. So each point should be about 1 day, roughly.
So down to a 2, you'd be at 8 days.
At 2 compared to 2.8 or 2.9 would be about 8 and 9 days.
This is done in the mid-planting window?
Yeah, I don't remember the planting dates exactly, but it was somewhere probably between middle to maybe 3rd week of May. So it would be correspond to his mid-planting dates in Michigan. So Clark County was our other location, 16 cultivars. We didn't go quite as low in Clark County. We went to 1.1 to 4.6, so we went a little bit on the later end there. But very similar trend. The yield increases with relative maturity until that 3.2 at that location. And then anything between a 3.2 and a 4.6 was a very similar yield. That's where that line becomes flat. In that span, that's about a 15-day difference. So in terms of weather getting bad in the fall, it gets wet, you can't harvest, you want to plant wheat, cover crop, something like that, that helps opens that window a little bit. And there's really not a whole lot of yield differences. So any questions about that?
Back up a couple there.
Yep, this one?
One more. Where you had the 2.9 and the, so you don't have a slide where you group the next maturity group down and say, okay, those were the same. But essentially, what somebody else said is like from a 2.0 to that 2.8 then made the same.
So yeah, yield-wise. So this is what is I think it's a quadratic plateau model. So the way the quadratic plateau model works is that there's a more drastic increase in yield, and then it kind of flattens out. Technically, the point it flattens out is right here, but that slope becomes a lot less earlier, if that makes sense. So the yield penalty is more going down here, and it becomes less with that quadratic, and then the plateau, actual plateau point is right there.
Yeah, and I understand what I'm
Yeah.
saying there. So like somebody though, like who doesn't plant a 3.8, so say we max out at a 3.1, okay?
Mm-hmm.
As long as we go to a 2.0, we don't get penalized too bad?
Yeah, there might be a little bit of penalty. I don't know what the yield difference is there, a couple bushels. Any other questions about that? So what else do you want to hear about? It's nice to highlight the colors of Don in case you fell asleep. What was that? Row width.
Do you have that on planting date?
No, kind of. Yes, kind of. So this is a different kind of study. This was something we looked at multi-state across the U.S. And so agronomists, soybean agronomists specifically, have been getting together and looking at our data. Okay, what data do we have? All of us have. The trials might be slightly different. Maybe Manny has planting date and row width. I had seeding rate and row width. So we all have row width. It's a common thread. So we can analyze the data together with help from a statistician. So we had over 7,000 data points in this analysis. From Ohio, we had data here in Wood County, and then also in Worcester and Wayne County. What they did first as part of this analysis, they looked at the weather and then grouped these states into similar weather or similar environments. So everything in red would be considered a pretty similar environment. So Ohio is kind of this central region, and then we have some northern environments and southern. So red is what applies to Ohio. So just talking about row width in general, Ohio, most soybeans are grown in what I would consider narrow rows, which is 15 or 7.5. There's a few wide rows, that's the green slivers, but most 15-inch, 7.5 is predominant. As you go further west, wide rows, 30-inch rows become a lot more common. I always tell my colleagues it's because they focus too much on corn. They're not very good soybean farmers. Ohio, we're better soybean farmers. Michigan's a little iffy too. They have some 30-inch rows. I spent some time in Michigan. I tell people that, and they think I went to jail. But I spent 3 years in Michigan. But looking at row width, this is central, so this would be applied Ohio. This is looking at wide row versus narrow row. So if this is a perfect straight line, that means there's no difference. There's slightly more points towards the narrow rows, so that means there's a yield advantage to narrow rows. This study only compared 30 and 15, not 7.5, because going back, the other states don't have 7.5. So this is just 15s and 30s. In Ohio, the central region, that yield advantage was about 1.6 bushels to the narrow rows versus wide rows, which isn't a huge difference. The northern environments had a bigger yield difference. It was 3.6 bushels per acre, and they attributed this to later planting. So in the north, it's hard to plant sometimes, and so the later you plant, the narrower rows you want to capture sunlight more efficiently. The south also had a really big yield difference. In the south, there was an 8 bushel yield advantage to those 15-inch rows versus 7.5s, and they attributed that to the weather. Soybeans don't really like hot, warm weather, and so you want canopy closure quicker so you have less evapotranspiration and a cooler canopy temperature. There you go. We didn't have a lot of data from the south. This is where the data from the south came from in the analysis. So Tennessee, Arkansas, North Carolina, Virginia. So it wasn't like super deep south, but. So any questions about that? We've done some work looking at 7.5-inch rows in our data, and usually 15 and a 7.5-inch rows yield about the same. The biggest yield penalty is going out to those 30-inch rows. So. All right, so we have benefits to wheat and seeding rate. We're really burning through this. What was that? Rate? So this is another similar study as the row width one. The agronomists got together and said, okay, what do we all have data on? we all have data on seeding rate. So we put those data together. We had 211 field studies with Ohio included, and Ohio was actually extremely well represented. This includes both our small plot research, on-farm research with maybe some of you guys here, and then also some data from eFields a few years ago. So Ohio was extremely well represented, which is great. What they did, similar to the row width study, they grouped these studies into different environments based on similar growing conditions. And so Ohio was mostly this red or green environment, cluster 2 or cluster 3. I'm just going to focus on cluster 2 because that was the majority of Ohio. And then cluster 1 was the extreme north sites, Wisconsin, North Dakota, South Dakota area. And so they first grouped by environment, growing conditions. Then they grouped the data again by yield level. And so high, they considered over 71 bushels per acre. Medium was 58 to 71, and then low was 58 bushels per acre because your seeding rate depends on your yield potential. And so this is a low yielding areas, 58 bushels per acre, which may not be low yielding every year, but 58 in this study. The agronomic optimum seeding rate, so this is a seeding rate where yield was the highest, was 170,000 seeds per acre. So it's high, very high. What they did then is they looked at the probability of yield increase. So if you plant 170,000 seeds per acre, if you increase your yield or your seeding rate to these levels, you have about a 50% probability of a yield increase, and this is your yield increase. Not very much, right? So there is likelihood you can increase your yield, but it's going to be not great. They did the same thing here. So this was agronomic optimum where yield is the highest. What happens if I go 10% lower, 20% lower, 30% lower? The probability of a yield increase is lower, which makes sense because you're dropping less seed. But the yield penalty is also pretty small. So this is where yield is maximized. You go to 153, you lose 0.06 bushels per acre. Have you guys looked at the eField report? Or some of those or seeding rate trials, just seeding rate trials in general. On farm, usually they range from 100,000 to maybe, 160,000 seeds per acre is what a farmer will put down on strips. Usually the yield response is pretty flat. I think Manny showed some of that. Until you got to June, Manny, the yield response was flat, and that's kind of what you're looking at here. Agronomically, 170 was where the yield was highest, but really the response curve is pretty flat. That's for low yielding. The medium yield, 58 to 71 bushels per acre, and that probably represents this area pretty well. Is that? Yeah. Maybe not this past year necessarily, but 58 to 71 bushel per acre yield level. The agronomic optimum was 146, so lower. So higher yield, a little bit lower seeding rate. Again, if we go 10% higher, 20% higher, 30% higher, there is a probability, high probability that your yield will increase, but again, it's at a very small level, less than a tenth of a bushel. If you go into lower seeding rates, down to 30% lower is 102,000 seeds per acre. No chance of a yield increase, and there is likelihood to be a yield penalty, but less than a bushel per acre with those lower.
You didn't have those associated to row with at all, did you?
These were not associated to row with. Yeah, these are not associated to a row width. It would be across the row widths in the study since it's multi-state. I know personally from Ohio we had 7.5, 15, and 30-inch rows in this study. The on-farm stuff was probably 15-inch rows in Ohio. The other states were probably 15 or 30, some combination. So this is set. We just averaged across the row widths. Yeah.
Do you have the range of change in yield for all those sites?
So there's a publication, so it's on Sean Conley's website. His website's Cool Beans. He has this as a table, and he has the standard deviation as well. So it's not the range. So if you want, the standard deviations were usually about 0.3, 0.5 bushels per acre. So that has, I didn't include that. I didn't want another number column, but the publication does have standard deviation. Because there is error around those values. Yes?
We did Economic Optimum, were they on this?
So they didn't look at, you were part of this study, Manny, you should answer the question, but they didn't look at the economic optimum, but that's a really good comment because you can drop more seed, but that yield increase doesn't do anything, absolutely. So the super high yields, 71 bushels per acre, our agronomic optimum is now even lower. So we went from 170 to, I think, was it 146 to 128. So higher yielding conditions, lower seeds. And I think that's a lot of what variable rate seeding looks at. The higher yielding areas, you can drop your seeding rate. So that's similar here. Agronomic optimum was 128. Again, if you increase your seeding rates, you will likely increase your yield. But again, pretty small value there. If you drop your seeding rate, you're not likely to increase your yield. You'll likely decrease it, but the most we had was about a half bushel as an average. But there is variability in that number as well. So.
What are the thoughts no-till versus conventional till? Did that change much with the rates or not?
So that's a good question. So the question was no-till versus conventional till. This again was across all of that. We didn't tease that out. And I don't really even have very good data in that. I try to avoid tillage studies at all costs. They're really hard to do in terms of timing. We just like to plant when we can plant. So we haven't looked at that. With no-till, usually the soils are cooler and wetter, so those can be some issues. What I usually tell farmers is you kind of have to know your field and what you're doing. And so if you're a no-till farmer and you know maybe your stand is reduced a little bit because you're planting to cooler, wetter conditions, or you have disease issues, increase your seeding rate because you know your field. With our data, when we're planting in May, we want to see a final stand of at least 100,000 seeds per acre. So if you're a no-till farmer, you have cold, wet conditions, you're not getting 100,000 plants per acre at harvest, increase your seeding rate. If you plant 140 and you're hitting that easily, that target, maybe you can reduce your seeding rate a little bit. So final stand is a much better predictor of yield than your seeding rate. The relationship between seeding rate and yield is awful, really, really bad. This relationship is a lot stronger. So that threshold for May, at least 100,000 plants per acre is what we like to see. If you're planting in June, 130 is the number. So you want to have more plants per acre at harvest in June. And then double crop soybeans, I really increase the seeding rate. We usually plant double crop soybeans at 250,000 seeds per acre to get a stand of at least, hopefully, 180 at harvest. So, yeah, so these are good values to keep in mind. So if you haven't done a fall stand count, it's a really good thing to do because you'll be astonished at what you plant and sometimes what you see at the end of the year, and it can be a really big difference that you may not see from the combine either, because those soybean plants will branch out similar to what Manny showed. So from the combine, it may look like you have all your plants there, but you really probably don't. Sometimes at our higher seeding rates, 250,000 seeds per acre, sometimes we have half the plants left at harvest because those plants will compete and self-thin, and they're just not there. So, any questions about that? All right.
Consider any work with like a high-speed planter that's got all the bells and whistles for the soybean planting and population. And the view we've got is if we do a much better job planting our crop, we can reduce our population because we've got better seed spacing, better seed depth, and better emergence.
Yeah, that's a great question about high-speed planting and accuracy and things like that. We haven't looked at that. We're doing some on-farm work now, looking at self-thinning just in general. So how important is plant-to-plant spacing? So we're looking at coefficient of variation, very similar to what Dennis is doing. So that plant-to-plant spacing, is it important or is it not important? That's what we're looking at, and I don't have the answer right now, but we're heading that direction. Yeah, because drills do not have that. But soybean plants are also really good at compensating too. So, yeah. Any other questions about seeding rate? All right, so we'll circle back to wheat then. I'm sorry, Dennis, you must have done such a good job. The benefits of wheat in Ohio are not as, you've covered it all. But we started a rotation study in 2012. We haven't published it yet, but we started in 2012 in Wood County and Clark County, just to try to quantify the value of wheat. Because we have this wheat guide, it's really outdated now, but we had this value, if you have wheat in rotation, you get this huge yield increase. And it's like, we had no idea where that number came from. Is it just something someone wrote, or is it based on research? We had no idea. So we started a really simple study, just comparing corn, soybean, and corn, soybean, wheat. That's it. And we have every crop every year. And so this is something that a graduate student has put together. She's in a lab in plant pathology, but she's been working with the data. So these are her slides. But NWARS is Wood County, WARS is Clark County, 2018, 2019, and we're looking at soybean yield in that 2-year rotation. So that's corn, soybean versus corn, soybean, wheat. Northwest Ohio 2018, this was statistically significant, a 3 bushel per acre yield advantage to that 3-year rotation. Same year at Western, it was non-significant, but a 2 bushel disadvantage. 2019, you can see our yields were variable because 2019, that's all I'll say. But not statistically significant, but a 7 bushel acre yield benefit to that 3-year rotation, and then 4 bushels at the other location in Western Ohio. Going back, looking at the other years, 2016, 2017, I don't have those slides together, but usually soybean yield is roughly 3-5 bushels per acre greater in that 3-year rotation versus a 2-year rotation. So very similar to what Dennis is showing. The student also looked at stand, soybean stand, and she did stand counts, seedling stand counts. What was really interesting in 2018 in Clark County, where we had the 3-year rotation, stand was greater. It was 109,000 plants per acre. That 2-year rotation was 89. So that 3-year rotation had better stand. We also had a cover crop study the same year, same location, same year. And where we had cover crop, we also had a better stand. And if you remember 2018, we had a lot of intense rainfall, extremely intense rain, and a lot of days with rain. And my students observationally noticed that where there was a cover crop, there was better infiltration, and that helped the stand. So this, I think, would be similar here, where we had that better stand with that 3-year location. The other locations, there was no significant difference with stand. The student also looked at root biomass, and this would be seedling root biomass. And seedling root biomass was also slightly greater in that 3-year rotation. So I don't know what those differences mean necessarily biologically, but there was a 7 bushel per acre yield increase. So seedling biomass was greater in that wheat rotation. And then shoots followed a similar trend, that same location where we had that 7 bushel yield advantage. There was a more seedling above ground biomass as well. This is looking at soil organic matter. So the student pulled soil samples from all of these plots, and 3 out of 4 of these site years, soil organic matter was greater in that 3-year rotation. And these were maintained no-till, and we didn't remove the straw. So both of those play a role. But I think this is pretty significant, going from about 5% even to 5.2% in Northwest Ohio. And this rotation isn't super long-term. This would have been 7 years at this point. So we can actually measure increases in soil organic matter, which is really, really cool. And we saw that at the other, both years, or both locations in 2019 as well. So this is getting way out of my area, but I'll try to talk about it anyways. So this is a plant pathology project, and so the student is really interested in the bacterial community and diversity of the microbes in these plots. In terms of just the community diversity in general, there was no difference between those 2 rotations, but she did see a higher amount or a higher abundance of beneficial bacteria in that corn, soybean, wheat rotation. And what that means in terms of yield and how that all plays into yield, I don't really know, but beneficial bacteria were higher abundance in that corn, soy, wheat rotation. And there was one soil-borne pathogen, taxa, that was lower in that corn, soybean, wheat rotation. So a lot of times with these yield increases, we always talk about a rotation effect. and that's kind of vague what that means necessarily, but I think some of this soil bacterial community plays a role in some of those yield increases that we see. And the plant pathologist, she said her next treatment she wants to try is red clover. And you talked about it this morning, so I think our plots are large enough. She wanted to go there, and since you mentioned it this morning, I think frost seeding or red clover would be a really interesting addition to this study. So, yeah, any questions about that?
When do you think you'll publish that?
So this student is defending in like a month, and she's going to show me a first draft of a publication in the next couple weeks. So if I review it in a week and she submits it within a month, it'll take about a year to get out because that's the publication timeline. But I told her it would make a really good fact sheet, and so I think she should. I told her if she wants to get a PhD, this would make a really good fact sheet for her to work on because it's really good data.
Do you have the corn response also? You showed the soybean response.
Yeah, so the corn response, we haven't looked at it quite as closely because, again, corn's like a rotational crop for soybean in Ohio. But we did look at the corn response. It's not as promising, especially in northwest Ohio. It was no-till, and we didn't remove the straw, and then planted corn. And some of those years, I don't remember, it was 2018, might have been 17, it was really cold, it was really wet, and emergence was really bad. So sometimes corn, maybe there's no difference. Sometimes there's a yield penalty. But usually the soil or the soybean increase helps pay for that penalty on the corn side. I think if you managed the corn differently, if we did tillage, remove the straw, that would remove some of the penalty. But sometimes we do see a pretty big penalty with corn in this system.
The red clover in that wheat stubble on the corn makes a big difference.
So red clover.
A good addition.
Yeah, we'll do red clover. And our plots are big enough we can split them so we can have corn, soybean, wheat, red clover. So, yeah, we can do that.